Here are just some of the things that Donald Trump has done since his return to the White House. He withdrew the U.S. from the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Accord. He threatened to take back the Panama Canal. He appointed vaccine skeptic Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as health secretary. Did you catch that? Well, that was just the first week. It's been a flurry of executive actions and announcements that I don't think any one person can easily wrap their head around.
The first item that President Trump is signing is the rescission of 78 Biden-era executive actions.
Some would say they're just getting on with fulfilling promises to voters, to overhaul American government and society. Others would suggest a more calculated objective here, something former Trump advisor Steve Bannon called
flood the zone.
By that, he meant doing so much so fast that those opposing him are overwhelmed by the sheer fact that they can't keep track of what's going on. In this video, I'm going to try to make sense of what the Trump administration has done since taking office on January 20th. I'll look at three major themes: slashing the federal government, sealing the southern border, and taming the left and progressive policies he calls woke. I'll also look at the ways he's used his presidential powers to carry out his agenda. To help me answer the question, what is Trump doing? I've spoken at length with two people who have significant insights, but very different perspectives. Dr. James Orr is Professor of Philosophy of Religion at Cambridge University and chair of the Edmund Burke Foundation UK, an institute dedicated to national conservatism. He's also friends with Vice President JD Vance, and the two remain in close contact.
Do you see America as a nation, or do you see it as an empire? And MAGA sees it as a nation first and foremost, and not as a global American empire, not an economic zone, not just a chunk of land that can be inhabited by pretty much anyone who wants to be there.
Kenneth Roth was executive director of Human Rights Watch from 1993 until 2022 and has just published the book Righting Wrongs: 3 Decades on the Front Lines Fighting Abusive Governments.
Trump aspires to build an autocracy in the United States. He wants to undermine the rule of law.
One caveat before we get started: we'll look only briefly at Trump's projection of American power in the world. To go deeper on that, check out my colleague Richard Walker's video, linked in the description. On the face of it, making cuts to the federal bureaucracy should not have been controversial. It was an idea supported not just by Trump's voters, but by large parts of American society. With an executive order, Trump created DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, led by billionaire Elon Musk, to do what even right-wing commentators warned would be next to impossible: reducing the national debt by cutting government spending. Its first act was to dismantle the world's single largest distributor of international aid, USAID. On February 3rd, Musk posted on X, "We spent the weekend feeding USAID into the wood chipper." The Trump administration effectively shut down several other institutions, including the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the International Broadcasters Voice of America and Radio Free Liberty, and the Institute of Peace, where DOGE employees only got in when they took an FBI escort.
Now Virginia Congressman Don Beyer is calling DOGE's actions a break-in.
The administration has also issued orders to stop most work at the Department of Education and has made large cuts at the Internal Revenue Service, which is responsible for collecting taxes, and the National Institutes of Health, which fund research on cancer and contagious diseases. DOGE claims it has found large-scale waste in the federal budget, like what it identified as a $230,000 grant to make organic shea butter in Burkina Faso, and a number of grants for research into the health effects of transgender hormone therapy in rodents.
$8 million for making mice transgender. This is real.
DOGE has laid off 56,000 federal workers so far, and estimates it has saved taxpayers around $155 billion. That's a long way off from Musk's original promise of $1 trillion in cuts. And multiple investigations by journalists show that some of the biggest savings posted to the DOGE website were hugely overestimated.
Some of the things that I say will be incorrect and should be corrected. So nobody's going to bat 1,000. I mean, we will make mistakes, but we'll act quickly to correct any mistakes.
Polls show that the idea of cutting government bloat remains overwhelmingly popular, but a poll in March showed 60% of voters disapproved of the way Musk was going about it. So has DOGE gone too far?
The restructuring of the American government is led in part by a sense that there's extraordinary levels of waste, abuse, and fraud of the American people. How can it be in the interest of the American taxpayer that billions, hundreds of billions of dollars are being spent on things that the American taxpayer knows absolutely nothing about? The list went on and on and on. I mean, it was just a scandal.
Musk has made it clear that Doge isn't just aiming to save taxpayers' money. He wants to bring the federal bureaucracy to heel.
We have this unelected, fourth unconstitutional branch of government, which is the bureaucracy, which has, in a lot of ways, currently more power than any elected representative. So it's just something we've got to fix.
Trump is using the rhetoric of, a deep state, a bloated state, to make profound cuts. Some quite targeted by trying to neutralize the FBI as a force that could actually constrain the president, by trying to attack the IRS as a force that can effectively monitor the tax returns of wealthy people. Some of this is quite focused, but a lot of it is almost ideological. Why is he cutting public health? Well, this is still fighting the battles over mask mandates and school lockdowns from COVID. But, are the American people served by no longer having a public health system that can look at, whether, for example, bird flu has evolved into a lethal human-to-human transmission threat? These are not things that serve the American people. There will come a time when it becomes apparent. Sadly, we may have to allow this to advance a bit for people to understand the devastating consequences of so many of Trump's cuts and attacks on the US government.
I put this claim to James Orr that Trump's restructuring of the federal government and cuts to the IRS and the FBI are politically motivated, that they amount to a power grab.
Well, it's a strange power grab where the central objective of the power grab is to dissolve the power of the administrative executive state. It's a strange power grab that looks to, for example, dissolve the entire Department of Education and return its competencies to the states, away from the power of the president. It's a strange power grab to massively cut federal funding for an executive body that is formally, under the Constitution, under the sole authority of the president. So I don't understand this objection at all.
Perhaps no other issue was more prominent in Trump's election campaign than immigration.
We will begin the largest deportation operation in American history.
Of the 26 executive orders Trump signed on day one, 10 were on immigration policy. These included sending an additional 1,500 troops to the southern border to prevent crossings and halting all asylum applicants from entering the U.S., including over 100,000 whose applications had already been approved. Illegal entries have clearly dropped. In February, border authorities apprehended 8,450 people attempting to enter. That's the lowest number since monthly tallies began 25 years ago. This drop in illegal entries is stark, though some analysts argue it has more to do with a tightening U.S. labor market than any White House policies. So what about the promised largest deportation operation in American history? The rate of deportations in Trump's first couple of months was lower than they were in Biden's last year in office, but it feels different. The government's targeted deportations of people residing illegally in the U.S. have been aggressive. The administration has been releasing videos like this, Indians sent home in shackles, the images igniting protests across their country. In March, Trump invoked a Wartime Powers Act, despite the fact that the U.S. is not at war. The aim, to deport Venezuelan migrants without due process. The administration claimed they were gang members and so a threat to national security. When a court ordered officials to pause the deportations, they appeared to defy the order, flying 137 Venezuelans to a notorious prison in El Salvador. These were just the first of a series of controversial deportation efforts that have reached all corners of the country.
Immigration into the United States across the Mexican border has largely stopped. And so, in that sense, it was successful what Trump did, but let's look at the cost. First, he essentially has ripped up the right to asylum. People who arrive at the Mexican border as anyplace else, if they're fleeing persecution or war, have a right to present themselves to a U.S. border official and say, I want my claim heard. Trump has basically stopped that. So that's illegal. Second, what he's done is instead of just deploying people along the border, which is, fair enough. Nobody says the U.S. has to have open borders. But Trump is also deploying immigrant agents across the United States, trying to swoop into workplaces or schools or wherever where he suspects undocumented immigrants are and randomly pick them up. There's been much more noise than reality in these deportations, but people are scared. And suddenly you see immigrant communities not going to work, not sending their kids to school for fear that they don't come home.
You got to remember that this is something that the Biden administration for 4 years had assured the American people was impossible. Was impossible without, that it's all Congress's fault. Without congressional legislation, this would be impossible. The Trump 2.0, within 2 weeks, had taken the numbers down to statistically insignificant levels. Without any just through executive orders, just through the power of the pen in the Oval Office. I mean, they're not refugees, overwhelmingly not refugees. They're not fleeing a war-torn country. They're simply exploiting a very, very, historically, a very, very radical policy, namely, roughly speaking, an open borders policy. And a government that runs an open borders policy is a government that is refusing to recognize the existence of the nation that has entrusted it with power.
Some of the highest profile deportation cases haven't involved illegal immigrants, but university students with residence permits. They include Mahmoud Khalil, a green card carrying student at Columbia University who'd been involved in pro-Palestinian protests, and Rumeysa Öztürk, a student at Tufts University in Massachusetts who wrote an op-ed against the Israeli military campaign in Gaza. In March, she was cornered by ICE agents and sent to immigration detention. Secretary of State Marco Rubio admitted her arrest was political.
Oh, we revoked her visa. It's an F1 visa, I believe. We revoked it, and here's why. And I'll say it again. If you apply for a visa to enter the United States and be a student, and you tell us that the reason why you're coming to the United States is not just because you want to write op-eds, but because you want to participate in movements that are involved in doing things like vandalizing universities, harassing students, taking over buildings, creating a ruckus, we're not going to give you a visa.
By the end of March, the State Department said they had revoked over 300 student visas on these grounds. I asked James Orr why he thinks the Trump administration has been targeting international students in particular.
Well, you'd have to look at each case on a case-by-case basis, and there's no doubt that they've been very aggressive in deportations of pro-terrorist, pro-Hamas activists. I don't know. I think the view I take there is that with a lot of these issues, you've got to send strong signals and strong signals of deterrence. I suspect, no one who is not an American citizen has any rights at all to be in the United States, except for where the United States has given them permission. And that permission comes with a very clear set of conditions.
The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution makes clear that anybody in the United States, whether a citizen or not, has free speech. And so all of these protests are presumptively protected. Trump has been using a loophole in immigration law that allows deportation for somebody who presents a threat to U.S. foreign policy. It is ridiculous to think that, some protester sitting in, Columbia's main yard threatens any part of U.S. foreign policy. This is a ridiculous pretext to silence criticism of Israel. And I suspect the courts will stop it in the end, but the signal is clear. You criticize Israel, you are at risk.
These students' cases are clearly about something more than immigration. That takes us to our next chapter. The Trump administration isn't just targeting student activists, it's targeting their universities. In March, the Department of Justice launched
an investigation into Columbia University for harboring and concealing illegal aliens.
Over 40 other universities have come under investigation as well, including some of the nation's most prestigious institutions, Harvard, Princeton, Brown, and Cornell. The cases are largely focused on their handling of pro-Palestinian protests on campus, but also for their diversity hiring policies and inclusion of transgender athletes in sports. Billions of dollars in federal university grants are on hold as a result. Why does the Trump administration appear to be at loggerheads with universities?
Well, gosh, where do I start? First of all, the American right correctly recognizes that elite universities have been for decades an engine room, a training ground for the left. We're talking of some disciplines, anthropology, sociology, where there are just zero Republicans. I mean, just zero, and not even to say pro-Trump, just no Republicans at all. And so the question then is, well, why should the American taxpayer, half of whom are Republican, why should their taxes be subsidizing as it were, an engine, a machine that is basically indoctrinating to a large extent, inculcating in America's young one particular, maybe it's true, but it's a contentious view that the other half, that only the other half believes in.
Trump's attacks on the universities, led foremost by Columbia, is, principally an attack on criticism of Israel. And secondarily, part of his broader effort to undermine independent centers of thought that could be a focus of a restraint on his executive powers. Because, clearly American universities are largely liberal. These are people who largely believe in rights, democracy, the rule of law. These are centers of thought that don't buy into Trumpism, who don't believe that Trump should be king, as he sometimes jokingly refers to himself. So it's not surprising that the universities are among the first institutions that Trump targets.
Let's take a closer look at those two other progressive issues Trump has zeroed in on: diversity hiring and transgender rights. Trump declared that the federal government will only recognize two genders, male and female. He ordered an end to federal funding for gender reassignment therapy for minors, barred trans people from serving in the military, a move so far blocked by courts, and ordered the Justice Department to crack down on trans women participating in women's sports, threatening states that ignored the order.
Is Maine here, the governor of Maine? You better comply, because otherwise you're not getting any federal funding.
See you in court.
Every state, good, I'll see you in court. I look forward to that. That should be a real easy one. And enjoy your life after governor, because I don't think you'll be in elected politics.
This has been relatively popular with the majority of Americans, but for the minorities directly affected, it's been a frightening time.
These announcements and these policy changes really affect people on a deep level that I don't think most cisgender people understand.
It sounds like we're going very, very backwards. And for it to be 2025, we haven't really gone that far forward. So I'm terrified.
The Trump administration has also attempted to completely end the practice of diversity hiring, known as DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, in the federal government.
DEI would have ruined our country, and now it's dead.
I think Trump figured out that progressives had gone a bit too far in their identity politics. And so, he actually didn't attack gays per se. He attacked, certain trans issues. Should trans women be allowed to compete in women's sports events? Should children be allowed to change their gender identity without their parents' permission? Certain things that actually many people disagreed with. And so he latched on those. He also clearly was appealing to his white working class base by attacking what was seen as preferential treatment for racial minorities. Even though that was designed to remedy historical discrimination, many working class whites felt, I'm left behind too. I'm not advancing in this globalized economy, and now I'm seeing other people advanced over me. So he built into, or he tapped into, genuine resentments.
Well, neither Trump nor Vance were at all shy about their position on transgenderism throughout the campaign. They won a popular mandate at all 7 swing states. and their mandate is what it is. So yes, I do think it resonated, and I think the electoral evidence is there to back that up.
As a sort of epilogue, I want to talk about Trump's use of power. There's a theory about Trump's first 3 months in office, that what he's doing is coming out strong, trying to shift the policy norms as far as possible ahead of an inevitable compromise, the one that most US presidents eventually have to make, with Congress to make policy into law, and with the courts who have to agree that the laws are constitutional. But then there's another theory, that Trump is looking for ways to carry out his agenda almost exclusively through executive action.
I think there are many areas where Trump is uninterested in a deal. He wants to undermine the checks and balances on his authority. He wants to really emerge in an autocratic position. One key chapter in the Autocrat's Handbook talks about how you need to undermine the rule of law. You need to put the executive above the law, not constrained by the law, even though being constrained by the law is what democracy requires. Now, Trump is doing this, partly by attacking judges, saying the judges who rule against him should be impeached. That, gets his far-right backers to physically and verbally threaten judges. So this is, an overt assault on the American judiciary.
If it's an autocracy that is being conducted within the parameters of the framers' constitutional vision. There's nothing unconstitutional about a president signing executive orders that can and are being contested in the courts, executive orders that may well be overruled by congressional legislation. This is just what presidents do. I mean, what was Obama's line? I have the power of the pen. I have a pen and a phone. Executive orders are executive orders. Are they arguing that the executive orders are somehow, relate to areas that executive orders are not allowed to relate to? Well, it'd be a matter for the courts, and that's why Trump's being sued on most of them. He's not saying to the courts, I will ignore what you say. If you strike down an executive order, I'm just going to do it anyway. By the way,
one comment that was particularly alarming to some people was actually from JD Vance, who said that the activist judges don't have the right to block Trump's legitimate use of his power. So that is one instance where people felt that he was saying essentially that Trump didn't have to obey the courts.
Vance was simply saying it cannot be the case that some unelected judge low down the ranks, who has been sought out specifically by an activist organization, can just paralyze the executive machinery of the United States government. That doesn't seem to me. It seems to me a completely plausible criticism. And I think there's a deeper problem here, Amien, that can a really polarized liberal democracy have a functioning judiciary?
Let's go back to the idea of flooding the zone. For the record, Trump has never claimed to be pursuing that tactic, but I still find it useful when thinking about how much of his agenda he expects to get through. Hundreds of lawsuits have been brought against his initiatives, and nearly 70 rulings have blocked his actions, at least temporarily. We've seen Trump levy enormous tariffs only to pause them after a few days. We've seen thousands of federal workers return to work after being laid off. We've seen an agency, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, slowly creep back to life after the Trump administration shuttered it. We've seen the administration threaten to send up to 30,000 undocumented migrants to Guantanamo Bay prison in Cuba, only to send about 300, and then return them to the US after a few weeks. In all the conversations I've had about Trump 2.0, there's a sense that we're living through a transition to a new era. But there's little clarity about what that era will look like when we get there.